is more light-hearted and something we've both been looking forward to for a while, Tom, is a discussion coming up in this section relating to the use of comedy and politics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's triggered this week because we've had a series of articles that have been sent in by a particular author, and this one is called Chaplin's Stiletto, which I'll very, very, very briefly bring up on the screen, but only to point out to the viewers what it looks like, perhaps, because it's a long article, and ultimately it's a brilliant article. And I know when you said when you read it, you agreed with pretty much every word written in it. So I'm not gonna hold off and go through any part of that article at all, because I won't do it justice. People need to go and read it from the beginning, possibly read it a number of times, and then engage in the thought processes that I think the article demands.
Fantastic article, and even though you say it's long, I mean it's written in a sort of almost conversational style with very short lines. So actually, it doesn't take long to read the article at all. You read through it very, very quickly, and it basically summarises under different headings that are given kind of amusing titles in a way, like Chaplin's Stiletto. It identifies different forms of comedy, different comedic forms that can be used, that can be utilised in the political battle, in the struggle, against our government, against the rich and powerful, against the people that control society. How comedy and different forms of comedy, can be, sarcasm, irony, etc., can be powerful weapons that ordinary people and social commentators can use to bring awareness to the wider public of what's really going on in a kind of fun, interesting, very shareable sort of way, but also, maybe that it's quite conceivable at times that comedy, and this has been proven in over a period of history, that comedy can be a powerful weapon that can even be significant in changing power and who holds power in society, and exposing crooks and corrupt politicians and getting rid of them. I mean, we think back to the days of the original Spitting Image as a great example of how television comedy programs such as Spitting Image can be very derisory about our politicians, show them up for who they are, sort of exaggerate their faults, but by doing so bring about quite a bit of awareness amongst the public of how corrupt they can be. And that's just one example. There's lots of examples of stand-up comedians, for example, who've been pretty instrumental in changing society's views on lots and lots of things. So yeah, very interesting article.
Oh, absolutely. And you say it's conversational style, but I've read it 3 or 4 times, and I find that with each block, so to speak, you've just got to stop and consider. It's not something that you can just read through, okay, I've read that, move on, that's very interesting. You have to take each bit as it comes, and then you have to sit back and you have to consider, what's he saying? What's the author saying? And how effective can it be? How effective has it been? Are there better ways? And I think that's an important consideration. I mean, can I just ask you an open question here, Tom? Do you think, or do you consider satire to be generally a good or bad thing?
A fantastic and very necessary thing, in my opinion. I mean, satire traditionally has been a tool of the oppressed to satirize the rich and powerful who control our lives and society for their own gain. So satirizing such powerful people is a vital tool, really, and arguably an essential element of democracy. In very, very dictatorial, autocratic societies, governments, satirizing the government it will see you in prison. So it's an element of free speech to be able to ridicule and satirize your own government and the people that hold power. For ordinary people to be able to do that, exercise their free speech to satirize and ridicule, to highlight the corruption of their government, it's an essential part of democracy, I would say. Would you agree?
I think my response is to be more nuanced. I think it's absolutely essential that we are able to do it without repercussions, but I'm far from convinced of its effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
We still have the same corrupt, unequal system, but we've had centuries of it. But let's just stick to the fairly recent past. Going back to the people like Monty Python, Dudley Cook, Peter Moore, etc. Dudley Moore, Peter Cook. Sorry, I don't. Looking over those 50 years, I don't think it's got us very far. It's if you look at Private Eye, for example, it's made some people fairly wealthy, fairly prominent. It's got them into programs like Have I Got News for You? But what has it really changed?
Yeah, I mean, arguably, there's a limit. The establishment, those with power, maybe allow for a certain amount of ridiculing and satirization, but they won't allow for it to the extent that it completely changes the nature of the power relationships that exist in society and who holds most of the power. I mean, arguably, spitting image is allowed, but if you had something that was really radical, and it was leading people to call for radical change, it wouldn't get on telly, because the powerful will make sure it wouldn't get on telly. So yeah, I see what you mean. That while satire and comedy can be a vital tool, it maybe doesn't change a huge amount. I think that's possibly, down to us as the public. Change only happens if a mass of people say that they demand it, and take action to demand it. We laugh along at spitting image and then carry on and vote for the establishment politicians, whoever they may be. Then that's our fault.
I think
we need to laugh along at them highlighting the utter corruption that exists. We need to laugh along and then vote for and demand something very different.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into the whole voting structure, and of course, as is famously said, if voting changed anything, they would ban it. But I think also it's about the choices that we're given, aren't we? When it comes to voting, it's not like we've had 4 years of satire that's ridiculed all the establishment parties, and then come the general election, a party is there that says that's it. We're going to equalize society. We're going to take the wealth away from the very rich. We're going to change property law. We're going to do all these things, but that party's never there. So it's like you go into the supermarket and you've got 2 brands of coffee, and I say 2 brands, but you've got bland 1 and you've got bland 2. You've got to choose one of the 2. And if you're going to vote and you think that you want to vote for a party that's got a chance of winning, you just pick out those 2 blands. Whereas all that satire over the 4 years has been telling us actually that we don't want either bland 1 or bland 2. But when it comes to it, we're never offered anything different. So I think I go along the replacement theory. I think sometimes satire is used to allow people to express themselves in humour and to laugh and to chuckle and to snigger. But ultimately, it is a replacement for action. Whereas people like you just said should be uniting, standing up, revolutionising society to make it a much nicer, much better, much cleaner, much safer place to be. In actual fact, all we do really is to sit down and watch satire, and that seems to be the beginning and end for many people.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. It could be a replacement, which is a worrying thought. I mean, you're right. If people just, watch Spitting Image and the next day in the workplace say, "Did you watch Spitting Image? Funny, wasn't it?" Okay. And then carry on doing their job. that's no good. If people say, "Did you watch Spitting Image? Bunch of corrupt people in charge, aren't they? What are we doing about it? Are we organising? You know, are we demanding something better?" That that would serve a real purpose. Yeah, you've got a t-shirt or a shirt on there, Jace, with a message. Tell us about that. Let me read it out. So it says, "When did mediocrity and banality become a good image for your children?" Who's that a quote from, Jace?
Well, that's Bill Hicks. And for me, he's one of the trilogy. If you're going to turn to political humour, there's a trilogy for me, that you have to at least start with, and that's Lenny Bruce, Bill Hicks, George Carlin, and watch them till you've got blood coming out of your eye ducts, and then you know that you've got to a point where you've consumed as much as you probably need to consume at that point, because they just they open up the can, and then they see loads of worms, and then they just walk around the population and tipping the worms over people's heads and saying, "This is reality, folks." All those images, picture images on the side of the can, do not represent anything that's inside the can. And it's up to us, according to those three, it's up to us to just tip that can out and just say, you know, hey, this is reality. This is what life experience is for a lot of people. And someone like, you know, George Carlin, I mean, just extraordinarily perceptive, extraordinarily able to narrate, to describe what reality really looks like. And obviously, he's an American comic. He's been dead, 13 years now, but he's extremely popular as well, you know, for a certain demographic. And I adore him. I certainly can't get enough of any of the all three of those, but certainly George Carlin. You know, it could be 24/7, wall to wall, because he's just so inspiring. Yeah. But it brings me to another subject, because when I read this article, and as I said, I went through it, and I stopped and I started, and I stopped and I started, and I was really thinking about it. And I started thinking about one of the things that tends to be ignored, because we talk a lot about racism in comedy, and we've got one set of comics we've identified, you know, the Bernard Mannings and the Jim Davidsons and a whole number of others who rely upon racism as part of their routine. And then you've got those on the other side who very much reject it and challenge it, which is brilliant. But one of the things that we've had very little of is social class. I think, you know, we've got the classic one, obviously, in the Frost Report with the two Ronnies and John Cleese, and, you know, the upper class, middle class, working class, which is in the late 1960s. It's obviously very much out of date now in terms of what class is, but, you know, it still holds together, and it's still very satirical and educational. But then I got on to thinking, well, how has it evolved? How has it developed? And I started thinking about Harry Enfield. Now, Harry Enfield had two major characters, both at the end of the class spectrum. On the one hand, he had loads of money, and on the other hand, he had, let's for example use the slobs, written with Paul Whitehouse. So what you have here is you have comedy and class dynamics at both ends of the spectrum. What are they trying to get over to us? What are they trying to get across? And I start to think, well, okay, with loads of money, it was a depiction of the yuppie 1980s Thatcherite, you know, society is dead. It's all about the individual. Make as much money as possible you possibly can. Be very materialistic. That then becomes a reflection of your identity. But he was sort of playing that on very much a satire, you know, loads of money and all that sort of stuff, walking around with a wad. Now, the thing about that is, of course, is that you can laugh at that person. You can take the mickey out of that person. But that person still will walk home, will go home at the end of the day, as a result of that loads of money, with a big house, the fast cars, access to private healthcare, access to private education. You go to the other end of the continent, if you like, with the slobs, where they have, you know, this, and it mixes in also with Matt Lucas as Vicky Pollard in Little Britain, they get society condemning them and laughing at them and whatever, but they don't have the chance to walk away with the big houses, the fast cars, and the access to private healthcare and education. All they get is people taking the piss.
Yeah.
So in actual fact, that in itself is a satire, but at the same time as being a satire, it still leaves us where we started. We're laughing, we're joking, we're taking the mick, we're creating labels, we're looking down on people, we're looking up at people. But at the end of it, those people were still where they started.
Yeah.
And that's what really concerns me. That for me outlines my absolute concern. And Kathy mentioned it there, even though she was probably using it as slightly the defense. They created cartoon characters. But these cartoon characters, and as we saw with Vicky Pollard as well, these cartoon characters have been used now to call people chavs, to make up a whole range of reasons why we should reduce benefits, to use, to reinvigorate that term benefit scrounger, to say that the working classes are lazy. It goes on and on and on. It just comes out of what we call satire. So the satire itself becomes poisonous.
Yeah. I mean, she's a national treasure, isn't she, Kathy Beck? And yeah, there is a lot of truth that in that, and that is obviously a danger. I mean, it is true that in terms of our sympathies were with Wayne and Waynetta slobs rather, because they were essentially good, kind people, but was not with loads of money as a character, because he was a greedy, so and so.
Yeah, but of course, can you say that, Tom? If I can just step in and interject here.
Yeah.
Actually, some of the analysis that's been done of that Harry Enfield character have actually found that, obviously, to say 50% or whatever, I'm not, but that's the narrative that was used in the analysis. But 50% thought, what a disgusting character. 50% thought, what's wrong with that? Bring it on.
Something to us.
I want a bit of it.
To.
Yeah.
I want a wad of cash. Yeah, of course. Well, especially since the days of Thatcher and the yuppies and the no such thing as society, everyone for themselves, greed is king, greed is God. A lot of people are attracted into that philosophy, that ideology. It's everyone for themselves, the rule of the jungle. And make as much money as you can, however you can, and if it hurts other people along the way, tough.
And I think that's the same. I think that's the same for satire, Tom. I think it's absolutely vital that humour and satire are there without punishment. That people have the freedom to do it and put it into practice. But I think it has to be done intelligently, and I think they have to look at the consequences of the satire. They have to look where it's going to take us, who's out there engaging with it, and how they will then subjectively represent it. Because if you don't, it just becomes, for those actors, it just becomes a way of living in a big house, having flashy cars, and sending kids to private education. That's what it becomes. It becomes a motor vehicle, if you like, for materialism. It doesn't really do anything constructive for the nature of society.
No. Before we finish, I just wanted to share with you and the viewers a couple of other things. Well, one is there's a very great sort of commentary on comedy, which says, if you want to know about, when you think about how comedy and power within a society operate, and the quote is something along the lines of, if you want to really find out about how the power relations are in any given society, then you look at the comedy and you look at who is the butt of the jokes. Who are the jokes at the expense of? Is it women? Is it black people? Is it people with disabilities? Is it people of a particular religion or tribe or what have you, in different societies around the world? And you can tell from that who wields the power and who are the oppressed groups in that society. And that's a very fair point. So it's probably as good a way as any. The other thing I wanted to share is some viewers will know this, but there was a wonderful play written in the 1970s about stand-up comedy, written by a Welsh playwright, Trevor Griffiths, and it's called Comedians, and it's set in an evening class for stand-up comics, a variety of different types of young aspiring stand-up comics learning their trade at an evening class with a very fantastic tutor, character called Eddie Waters. And there's some fantastic lines in the play, and my favourite line of Eddie Waters was, "Most comics feed prejudice and fear and blinkered vision, but the best ones illuminate them." And then he said, "Comedy is medicine, not coloured sweeties to rot their teeth with." What an incredible line. Comedy is medicine, not coloured sweeties to rot their teeth with. That's how comedy should be. And of course, he was advocating there for the stand-up comics in his class not to do the old-fashioned racist, sexist, homophobic, bullshit comedy full of rubbish prejudice one-liners that funny enough used to be the staple kind of comedy that would go around working class clubs, working men's clubs around the country, and you get those comedians like the Bernard Mannings and the Jim Davidson, old style type of prejudice comedians, spreading that nonsense prejudice humor to the working classes. And obviously over 30, 40 years now, we've seen the development of a completely different type of comedy. And as you mentioned earlier, there were early people like Lenny Bruce, Dick Gregory, George Carlin, Bill Hicks, etc., who helped to move comedy into a whole stand-up comedy into a whole different sphere of observational comedy, and comedy that actually highlighted issues of prejudice, issues of power and abuse of power, and demanded something different and made their audience think. So yeah, hopefully people will consider their comedy. Just one other fascinating thing is that the Tories, having taken control of the BBC, obviously in 2017, having got rid of the independent board of directors of the BBC and installed all their own Tory supporters and Tory donors to run the BBC, the BBC have recently announced that they're clamping down on left-wing comedians that are critical of the government. There's too many of them, and there needs to be more right-wing comedians. And of course, we've seen on social media, the BBC have been pumping out some content from these right-wing comedians, which is about as unfunny as you could possibly be. I sit there thinking, who on earth calls this comedy? It's about as unfunny as can possibly be. And one of the ones that they promoted, I've forgotten the chap's name actually, but one of the ones the BBC have been promoting has just been mired in a terrible scandal because he's just said the most horrifically prejudiced racist things. So I presume that BBC won't be promoting him anymore. But yeah, interesting topic, comedy.